This is Gibraltar Today. What do we want from our politicians? It's a question posed by Together Gibraltar's Nick Calamaro. In an opinion piece in the Gibraltar Chronicle newspaper, he interprets what he thinks the principal auditor's report tells us about politics in Gibraltar. He talks about opaque payments and power being concentrated in the hands of ministers. And Nick Calamaro's here now. Good afternoon. What's your sense of how this latest principal auditor's report has gone down, Nick?
So there's clearly been a lot of public backlash to it, a lot of outrage, a lot of a sense that a lot of the things people talk about on the street, kind of ideas that they have about the way government functions, they can now see in black upon white on paper and really confirming many of their worries about the way the government has operated.
So you talk about opaque payments. Why did you choose that language?
Well, what ultimately inspired the piece was I wanted to talk about fairness. Now, by fairness, I mean both the ways in which the report has laid out and people have experienced that there's a two-tier system where people's personal connections, who people know, can help them access public services. But I also wanted to be fair to the government ministers themselves, because getting to know many of them and seeing their work, I do know that they work incredibly hard. I do know that they try to do right by as many people as possible. And so I wanted to lay out the ways in which this two-tier system has come about without implying any sort of conspiracy or any kind of malicious intent.
So you make the case that too much power is concentrated in the hands of ministers.
That's right. And that's something we've seen in the audit report in a variety of ways. Two of the ones that have people the most worried are among the ex gratia payments and also among tender processors. Now, if you can give me a moment to explain with the ex gratia payments, many of those are legal settlements and they're things that often do have to be done behind closed doors. Now, I can understand why someone like Fabian Picardo, who's a very skilled lawyer, who's a great negotiator, might think I'm the best positioned to lead the settlement, to manage this process because I can get the best deal, possibly even the best deal for the taxpayer. When that happens once, that might be okay. When that happens 10, 20 times, and you have one individual, the chief minister, moving millions of pounds behind closed doors, that's when people start to ask questions. That's what I describe as a concentration of power that raises questions that would be better answered if that process was being conducted by an independent board, for example.
And the tender processes?
So the tender processes are similar. We do have complex systems. Government gets more complex every year. And some of these processes are very sensitive. The EMIS contract that was awarded was one that was raised, that it was important that that got handled quickly and dynamically to avoid having basically breaks in patients' ability to book payments. Now, I can understand, again, why a minister might want to get personally involved in that system to guarantee patient outcomes.
But this is the one at the hospital, not the digital system at the hospital.
Digital booking system for GP appointments. So I can understand why a minister might want to intervene, but when that process is then applied, again, to multiple projects, to the award for a tender of the Northern Defences, for example, where there have been questions about ministers' relationships with those companies, because it hasn't gone through an independent process, because it's gone through one individual who oftentimes do have, as we've seen with some of the payments being made to people in their parties, family members, etc., it makes it very difficult to judge the fairness of that system.
And on that point, you talk about the importance of personal connections. Isn't that, if you allow me to play devil's advocate a little bit, isn't that to some extent a reality of life, that there will always be holes in systems and that personal connections in many different areas of life, personal connections will matter?
So it is, but what I worry is in Gibraltar, because we've leaned so heavily on personal connections, many of these systems have actually fallen by the wayside and left in an unfit state. And successive governments, not just this government, have felt that their time is better served by helping individual cases, by acting as caseworkers rather than by updating these processes. We saw housing allocations, for example, which are very sensitive topics. You've had people who've come out of emergency care, you've had people with mental health issues being allocated housing. But that is something that we have to ask ourselves. If the current housing allocation process isn't serving these individuals, does it not make more sense to update our processes rather than just do it on a case-by-case basis?
And you also, for somebody who's just joining us, we're speaking to Nick Calamaro, the Together Gibraltar politician, political commentator, who's written a piece in the Gibraltar Chronicle newspaper, asking the question, what does Gibraltar want from its politicians? And in it, you say that you think the civil service lacks the expertise to address Gibraltar's evolving challenges. I imagine there may be one or two people in the civil service who might challenge that view, but perhaps I can ask you for an example.
Of course, and it goes department by department, so I wouldn't want to disparage anyone at all. My worry is more that civil servants often feel the need to manage personalities and their relationships with politics than they have full control over these processes that we're speaking about. For example, we spoke about housing. When someone has a problem with a housing situation, they're trying to apply to the list, they have a family member in an urgent situation, they don't feel like they can rely on the processes. They feel like they have to go directly to the housing minister or indeed even the chief minister themselves. That, to me, when spread across decades at this point, means that we have a civil service where people aren't feeling empowered to improve these processes, and we're not judging the system by the processes, but by the personal help we can get.
Okay, and as part of a solution, I mean, you do believe that there is a fairer way of doing politics. I mean, that you are sort of hopeful that we can do things better.
Yeah, so I've called out 3 groups in my piece. Obviously, it's multifaceted. But I've spoken about the young, oftentimes because they don't understand how things work. Oftentimes we can be, especially in Gibraltar, a bit naive and not realize when we're younger just how important those personal connections are. But it also leaves aside minorities and those who simply don't have personal connections because, again, they might be people who have been sidelined to Gibraltar, people who are new to Gibraltar, people who are maybe a bit quieter or more introverted. And I think it's unfair that our process, with no malicious intent whatsoever, does essentially discriminate against those people. I want to clarify, when I say personal connection, I don't mean that somebody is a member of the GSLP or somebody is a relative. It could be something as simple as having the wherewithal and the guts to go and speak to the minister, knock on their doors. I know many of the ministers are very open. They have an open door policy and they help people in that capacity. That's fantastic. But we also need to make sure that if we have proper channels, as we do, we have a housing list, we have applications via eGov to allocate housing stock. We have to make sure that the people who are putting their trust in that system aren't basically put in a worse system up against those who know that they can go knock on a door and get moved up the list.
And you've just referred to helpful involvement or potentially well-meaning involvement by a government minister. And in your piece, you say that with a hat of a trustee for men in need on, that the Justice Minister, Nigel Feetham, has gone above and beyond to help the charity. But we've also seen the charity's founder, Jane Wink, respond to say that she wasn't consulted ahead of your opinion piece. It's not the view of the charity. So can I ask you if your piece has caused a little bit of tension? You're both a political commentator and a charity trustee.
It does. Though in many ways, I worry that this is, again, to do with Gibraltar's very young political system. I mean, we've only had a parliament for about 60 years. So obviously we're still learning, we're still developing. And it's something that I've spoken, obviously I speak to Jane every day, and I've messaged the Minister Feetham, though I didn't mention him in my piece.
Not by name, but I thought that it was implied that he is the minister that has helped you, no?
Perhaps. Although other ministers have gotten involved, I just wanted to be clear that this was said in my capacity as a political commentator, and I had no ill intent. I mean, I said in my piece how grateful we are to these ministers for their help. They've turned people's lives around. They've really helped people access services. At the same time, like many politicians, I'm involved in charity work, and I think we need to be able to draw a distinction between when I'm working as a charity worker, petitioning the ministers to get the best outcomes for our service users, and when I'm talking about the system. At no point, I always make a point in my political work to never go after individuals, to never call out people by name. We're talking about systemic issues where it might be that all the people within this system have the best of intentions, but we should still assess it, see how we can learn, how we can do better.
All right. Nick Calamaro, thank you for joining us, the Together Gibraltar politician who has written a piece called "What Does Gibraltar Want from Its Politicians?" You can look it up in the Gibraltar Chronicle newspaper. We'll catch up with you again soon.